So when we look at the grid, reliability has to be our highest priority. People will say things like, oh, no, zero carbon has to be the highest priority, or renewable has to be the highest priority. Without reliability, none of those things are going to count.
So welcome back to another episode of our podcast. Today's guest is Meredith Angwin, a physical chemist who works on utility projects focusing on pollution control and corrosion control for a wide array of utility projects, including nuclear, geothermal, and hydrocarbon plants. Meredith is also the author of the book Shorting the Grid, The Hidden Fragility of Our Electric Grid, which is today's topic on our podcast. Thank you so much, Meredith Angwin, for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. I want to say that I spent a lot of my life working for utilities on utility projects. I'm not doing that now. I'm just a writer now. A writer
and grandmothering. That sounds like a pretty good way to spend some of the more mature years of your life.
Yeah.
So let's just jump right into it. Since the name of your book is called Shorting the Grid, this is a reference, of course, to The Big Short, which is the famous movie and book that described the financial collapse in 2000. Your main point of your book, Shorting the Grid, is that we're going to have a power grid collapse, like we did a financial collapse. We call that blackouts. So what specific evidence or indicators makes you believe that frequent blackouts will be a normal occurrence going forward in the U.S.?
Well, I was predicting that from the way the grid is being run. So, for example, there's not really a financial incentive. In many areas of the grid, there's no financial incentive for reliability. That's a big problem. And the other thing is, of course, in recent months, NERC has come out and said that big areas of the country are in danger of rolling blackouts. NERC is the National Energy Reliability Council. It has many different roles. One is evaluating the reliability of the grid, and the other is it sets up standards, for example, standards for running a substation, standards for training the linemen, whatever things add to reliability, they set standards for it. So they're very involved with the grid. They're not a hands-off a think tank, and they're concerned.
Can we just maybe take a step back? Can you briefly explain how the grid actually functions? When you say the grid, people just kind of gloss over and not really even knows what that means. Your book was pretty interesting. It's just so much more complex than I would have thought. I mean, you got the balancing authorities and RTOs, and then you got FERC, the governing body. Of course, you got the power plants, you have fuel sources, transmission lines, ratepayers. Can you just kind of give a summary of how all this interacts?
I'll try to. I have to admit that I wrote the book because when people would ask me questions, I would feel like I was beginning some kind of monologue because it's so complicated that to answer their questions, I just kept talking. So I thought, well, if I wrote a book on this, and the thing is, I also was trying to refer them to a book. And while there are books on the grid, none of them, at the time at least, covered the issues that I was addressing. Most of the books started with Thomas Edison and the Pearl Street Station, and that's great. I mean, it's important to know, but when you get right down to it, those aren't the problems the grid is having now. Okay, let's look at the grid as having three different units on it. The first is sources of electricity. They could be a power plant. They could be a rooftop solar. Okay. The second thing is transmission of electricity. In general, when we talk about transmission, we talk about large lines that go from a power plant to a substation, and then from the substation near your house or whatever. We were really talking about distribution of electricity. And the reason that this is important is in the old days, and the old days ended in about 1996, all of these things were basically the responsibility of one entity, which was a regulated utility that owned the power stations, or if they were a big power station and it was a small utility, it might have a share in the power station. And then there was the transmission lines, which were also owned, and then there was the distribution. And There were some bad things about this because it was clear that you have to have a regulation for this because you can only have one line to your house. Let's say I wanted to choose my utility. Well, am I going to have 5 different lines to my house and switch between them? And it's what's called a natural monopoly, like city water or city streets. You're not going to have a bunch of people competing to build some more streets. They're going to make that alley into a throughway. I mean, no, it has to be planned and stuff because it's big infrastructure and it's used by a lot of people. Anyway, so that's the basics of it. Well, what happened was that people began being concerned, and to some extent rightly so, that the utilities, they owned everything and they could also freeze out their competition by saying, I'm not going to let you use my transmission line, build your own, which would be, of course, way too expensive and for most competition. And also, because they weren't competing with anybody, they still had to make money. And so they were highly regulated and they got a, quote, rate of return. That is, let's say they invested $1 million in something, then they might have an 8% profit allowed. So they could charge their ratepayers $1 million plus 8% in order to have the profit. This actually worked fairly well because utilities were widows and orphan stocks because they were very reliable, both in terms of how they got the power to you and so forth. But a lot of people said, look, they get more money if they spend more money. We're getting a reliable grid, but we're getting a bit of a gold-plated grid here, aren't we? So they said, we've got to break this up and bring in the invisible hand of the market, which will make things better. So they did that. And so right now what you have is you have your local distribution utility, which runs basically from the substation to your house. And then you have the transmission utilities that operate the power lines under pretty strict oversight by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission so that different generators have good access to the power lines, okay? And then finally, you have the power plants themselves. So what happens, let's forget about the transmission utilities for a moment because they're heavily regulated and they don't come into the story a lot. They come in, but not a lot. Let's look at your distribution utility and the power plants. So the distribution utility, this is where the heavy hand of the market, the invisible hand, is supposed to come in. Your distribution utility buys power from the power plants, and then it distributes that power to the houses or whatever, and it maintains the lines that are near the houses, and it sends you bills. And if your area has some kind of government system for underwriting people, for example, around here, I think there's a law in most of the northern states that you can't shut off someone's power in between like November and March. Obviously, that's a law, and then they have to make up for that money somehow. Anyway, distribution utility does a lot of things. And one of the things it does is buy the power that it's going to distribute. So not every distribution utility just goes and makes a deal for the power. What happens is there's a problem with that whole thing. The problem is that unlike most things, you can't store electricity well. I mean, they're beginning to have some lithium battery things, but they really are just a small amount compared to what's on the grid. And so you have something called the balancing authority. What that is, it orders power plants on and offline because it has to meet exactly the amount that the customers want. So the customers want, 10 gigawatts right now, it has to have 10 gigawatts online. And if the customers want 20 gigawatts right now, it has to have 20 gigawatts online. So you have these people in the balancing authority dispatch room that are telling power plants, get offline and so forth. Because it has to be really balanced. Now you say, what do you mean by really balanced? I'm talking about if it's 60 hertz power, that is 60 cycles per second, which is what it is in America, then it really can't go below 59.75 cycles per second or above 0.25 cycles per second. And the thing is, if there's too many power plants compared to the demand, then the cycles per second are going to go up. And if they're too little, the cycles per second are going to go down, because that's how it works. The balancing authority really has an important job to do to keep the grid operating. If the balancing authority falls down on the job, which they never seem to do, they're very good. I give them all kinds of credit. Then the entire grid might go down. Okay, one more thing about this. The balancing authority has many levers it can pull to keep things in balance. One lever is it can tell a power plant time to get online. It can tell a power plant time to get offline. It can tell some people sign up for what's called demand response. It's not usually people signing up, it's big businesses. And they say, if you have too much demand on the grid and you're really having a problem, you just let me know and we'll cut back for a few hours. So the business promises to cut back on its demand on the grid for a few hours. That's demand response. But what if all this stuff isn't working? Like, for example, in Texas, in 2021, there was a lot of demand because it was very cold out, but the wind died down and they depend on wind. There were 20 gigawatts of wind on the grid, and then it went down to like 2. And for what it's worth, our New England grid at close to peak power is 20 gigawatts. So it's a lot of wind and a lot of wind going away. And then what usually happens to back up wind is they turn on natural gas. Well, they did. But the thing is, there wasn't enough natural gas supply. And I can get into why that was, but basically in cold weather, houses use natural gas and valves don't work as well to get the pipelines going, et cetera, et cetera. There are reasons why cold weather is hard on natural gas transportation. So they were stuck, right? Here they are, and the frequency is dropping to lowering and lowering. And at one point, it was like, if this keeps going this way, in 5 minutes, this whole state is going to be blacked out. Because when a major part of the grid goes down, it's a big deal. It takes a long time to bring it back up. A long time is like days or weeks, okay? It isn't like, the tree fell down and now we fixed it and now you got your power back. It's been 5 hours. It's not like that. We had a tree down here in a big windstorm just about a week ago, and it wasn't very dramatic. The tree falling was dramatic, but the power went back on within about 9 hours, even though it was a really big tree and they had to have a lot of people out here sewing it up. At any rate, I guess what I'm saying is that the grid operator has one more lever he can pull. And that is, he can say, there's too much demand on the grid, and I'm turning off some of the demand. In other words, some substation is no longer being supplied with power. Another place isn't being supplied with power. And when things get better, I'll turn them back on. This is called rolling blackouts, because usually the grid operator says, I'm going to black out areas for an hour each and then turn the power back on. Unfortunately, as demand is going up on the grid, because there's this whole electrify everything thing happening, and the supply is going down, that is the reliable supply of coal and nuclear and even natural gas, they're not being built. And what's being built is wind turbines, but the thing is, the wind turbines aren't a reliable supply. So you see, like in Texas, when the wind turbines went off, there wasn't enough natural gas to make up for it. So Texas had rolling blackouts, and it's not uncommon with rolling well, it's not totally common, but it's not totally uncommon. They don't necessarily roll. You say, they're going to be off for an hour, and then we'll turn it back on. But during that hour, things can be going bad in other parts of the grid. Anyway, long and short of it, Texas, a lot of places in Texas were blacked out for 48 hours under very cold circumstances, and And apparently 200 to 700 people, choose your number by who's estimating it, passed away from hypothermia or from carbon monoxide poisoning by trying to use heaters in the house that are really only supposed to be used outside and so forth.
And doesn't Texas, along with, I think it's Iowa, have the highest percentage of energy from wind turbines
Yes, it
in
does.
the nation? Right.
It does. And the trouble is a wind turbine and with solar too, and I don't mean to knock on these too much, but when you get right down to it, you got to have some kind of thing that backs them up when they're not available. So when the sun sets, you have to turn something else on. And when the wind dies down, because you can't control the wind, and when it dies down, you got to turn something else on. Usually the something else is natural gas, because natural gas can turn on very quickly. Steam-fired power plants are very reliable, but they're not very flexible. So if you've just lost, 10 gigawatts of wind, you can't just turn on a 10 gigawatt steam plant and expect that it'll be there for you in 2 minutes. If you think about many of the natural gas plants, gas turbines, they're basically internal combustion engines like your car. Not just like your car. Your car is a reciprocating engine, whatever. But what I'm trying to say is you turn them on and they're on. You don't have to worry a whole lot about, is it heating up the whole thing? Have we got enough pressure? All that sort of thing.
So Meredith Angwin is our guest today, author of the book, Shorting the Grid. And in your book, Meredith, you write, in many areas of the country, but especially in RTO areas, power installations that can operate only intermittently, such as solar and wind installations, are the sure bet for becoming wealthy. In the mortgage situation, the intrinsic value of the mortgage didn't matter. In the RTO area, the value of the power produced doesn't matter. As a matter of fact, less valuable power is more profitable. End of quote. Can you explain when you say less valuable power is more profitable?
Less valuable power is more profitable because, in general, it gets subsidies. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to take a little side effect talk here about how the auctions work. Remember, I told you the distribution utilities were buying from the auctions. Actually, what they do is they say how much they want at a time, and then the auction runs, and the results of the auction are assigned to the different utilities. Let's look at this auction for a minute. The auction is a very odd auction, but it's not completely unheard of. But it's not what you think of where the high. What it means is you're trying to get the cheapest plants online, the least expensive. So let's say the grid operator needs 10 gigawatts of power. I'm making all this up, okay? And there's a power plant that says, I'm a 5 gigawatt power plant. That would be huge. And I can give you 5 gigawatts at 10 cents per kilowatt. And then another one comes in and says, I'm a 2 gigawatt power plant, and I can give you 2 gigawatts at 7 cents per gigawatt hour. And then the third one comes in and says, I'm a 3 gigawatt power plant, and I can give you 3 gigawatts at 20 cents per gigawatt hour. So the grid operator says, we need 10, we need the 5, we need the 2, we need the 3. You're all online. And the 20 cent per kilowatt hour, the most expensive plant, has set the clearing price. You're all getting 20 cents per kilowatt hour. The plant that bid in at 10 cents, the plant that bid in at 12 cents or whatever, I don't remember the numbers I used this time, but the lowest price plant was 10 and the highest price plant was 20, and they're all getting 20. So you see, if you're a wind turbine, you're not a very expensive thing to operate most of the time, so you probably wouldn't be the highest price plant, but you're going to be the lowest price plant. And the reason is that every time you put a kilowatt hour on the grid, you're going to get 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour as a production tax credit from the federal government. That's an estimation. There are different rules for when the production tax credit was authorized. It's like one of these things where every 2 years they change it a little, but 2.5 cents is a good estimate. Then when you put that kilowatt hour on the grid, you make something invisible. You make something called the renewable energy credit. And a lot of power plants are required to have such a percentage of renewable energy on their grid. Well, that's in a way a very difficult requirement to meet, because all the energy on the grid, all the electricity, it kind of blends together. There's not this electron came from a wind turbine and that one came from a coal plant. You can't label them that way. So what has happened is that the distribution utility buys the renewable energy credit that the wind turbine made at the same time it was making a kilowatt hour of electricity. Now it's going to be, say, 4 cents. So it's getting 6.5 cents before it gets anything from it is not being paid for its electricity. It's being paid a production tax credit, and it's being paid for the renewable energy certificate, which is a piece of paper, not electricity. Well, one of the things that means is it can usually bid in at 0 cents per kilowatt hour. And that means if you're filling up, remember when I was saying the 10-cent one, and then the 20-cent one, and the 30-cent one, that means that the wind turbine will always be on the grid if it's available, because it's bidding in at 0. Or sometimes, let's be honest, they're allowed to bid in at -2 or something. They can say, I'll pay you 2 cents per kilowatt hour to take my power. Now, you understand that a regular business can't do that. I mean, that's not a good strategy for a regular business to pay you to take give a discount, okay. But the thing is that doesn't matter, because the grid operator is going to be paid 2 cents, but the power plant is going to get a minimum of 2 cents plus 4 cents from other sources. And so it's going to be okay, the wind turbine. It's going to be fine. That's what I mean by it's the best, most assured way to make money on the grid is to build a renewable.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with the book called The Grid, The Fraying Wires Between Americans and Our Energy Future, which is a famous book. I think it was published in 2017, recommended by Bill Gates. Yes. But she says in the book, quote, "It turns out that transitioning America away from a reliance on fossil fuels and towards more sustainable energy solutions will be possible only with a serious reimagination of our grid. The more we invest in green energy," which she uses in quotes, "the more fragile our grid becomes." Why does wind turbines and solar panels create this fragility? Subsidies is clearly part of the reason in regulation, but what are the primary reasons for that?
Okay, I'm going to talk for a minute about wind, and I'm just going to say that wind turns on and off when it wants to. It doesn't have anything to do with the demand on the grid. So you see the guys in the control room at the balancing authority, they may have high demand and low wind, or high wind and low demand, and they've got to deal with that. So let's look at solar for a minute. Okay, solar, the sun, a grid tends to be a given geographical area. It's not a theoretical concept. It's a geographical area. And let's be honest, the sun sets more or less at the same time all over that whole area. So the thing is that whatever solar you have on the grid, it's going to go away at the same time. Let's look at the grid in the old days before we had a lot of wind and solar on it, when we had coal plants and gas plants and hydro and nuclear. All these plants can be turned on and off when we want them to, unlike the sun and the wind. The nuclear and coal plants were slow to turn on and off, and the gas plant and the hydro plant were fast. But basically, the grid operator knows the characteristics of the plants, and the balancing authority did a good job of balancing it just by calling on the ones that have to be called on for the situation at hand. Okay, but meanwhile, we've got all these generating sources that go on and off when they're in the mood to, and the grid operator has to deal with that. Okay, let's go back to when there weren't those sources. How many plants did we have on the grid? Well, what the rule of thumb was that you take the highest demand on the grid, you add 10% of it to it, or maybe 15%, and then you say, I need to have plants that will give me 100% of the highest demand plus 50% above that. The idea is that maybe the demand will be going up, and so your highest demand estimate is wrong. And the other possibility is plants go offline for various reasons. A coal plant, for example, may have silica beginning. They may not have gotten the kind of coal they want. There's got all this silica happening, and they've got to do something about it. So they go offline for a while to clear it out. So you had whatever the highest demand was plus 15%. Now, let's say that you have 30% of your grid is wind. Well, okay, when the wind goes offline, you got to have some backup for it. So you have to have 30% backup. So what it boils down to is, unless you're investing in backup for the plants that go offline when they want to, you're not going to have a sturdy grid. So what it boils down to is you need to have way more power plants built and paid for with a grid that has a lot of the intermittent renewables that start and stop when they want to, than a grid that has regular plants and you're just looking at when they might have problems. There's a phrase, common mode failure, and one of the things about that phrase, people don't like it when I use it, but if you think about it, a coal plant that's having a problem, that doesn't mean that the coal plant next door is having the same problem. The coal plant just had some badly monitored coal coming in, and it's causing some havoc. But it'll get the havoc fixed pretty quickly, and the coal plant next door isn't affected. On the other hand, if you've got 30% of wind on your grid, and the wind dies down, it's a common mode failure for all the wind. The old business of we keep 10%, 15% extra in reserve assumes that not everything's going to fail at once, and it can't.
Yeah, I think in your book you talked about how basically you want a diverse set of fuel sources on the grid. Basically, solar power acts as one fuel source regardless of the region because, like you're saying, sun sets in similar time, and the same thing with wind. It acts almost as one fuel source versus nuclear and hydro and natural gas and coal.
Actually, solar acts as a mega plant. One of the things I didn't tell you about the grid is the rule of thumb is that there shouldn't be any plant on the grid that provides more than 10% of the electricity of the peak demand on the grid. The idea is that if you have plants that are providing 40%, well, then obviously this 10% margin isn't going to help you very much. So different plants provide a 10%. And so plants have to be sized to the grid. In other words, Palo Verde plant is a huge nuclear plant in Arizona, and it's sized fine because it supplies Phoenix and it supplies LA. I mean, it's not the only supplier, but you could get a lot. You could get a really big nuclear plant with those two cities running their air conditioners all the time. It's fine. But if you put that same plant, say, in northern Maine, it would be way too big for northern Maine. It would be more than Maine uses. So, you know, there's a lot to how you build and how you control the plants on the grid. And this rush to 100% renewables, the goal of the grid is to be 100% renewable. That's not the goal of the grid. The goal of the grid is to make reliable, affordable, low environmental impact power. And reliable and affordable are important because it can be as low environmental impact as you want. And if people can't get that power, there's going to be a lot of diesel generators going off all over the place.
Wait, when you referenced the 2021 blackout in Texas, would you say that the main reason was because their heavy reliance on wind turbines is the reason that they had those blackouts?
There's been an ongoing fight for 2 years about this, more than 2 years. But basically, the pro-renewable people say it's not because the wind died. The wind, when it went down, was only the amount that you would expect to have in the winter. We don't expect that much wind in winter. So it isn't that the wind went away. It's the renewables went offline. I mean, it's these fossil went offline. Well, yes, what happened was that when the wind went away, too much fossil was required, and some of it was indeed affected by the weather, so, the valves and so forth. And another thing which people don't like to talk about very much, but remember when I told you that the grid operator can turn off different areas? The grid operator in Texas was trying to save the grid by turning off different areas. Well, it turns out that the compressors, the pumps that move the gas along in the pipelines, were operated by electricity. And in some of the areas he turned off the compressors. So some gas plants were suddenly offline too. You can look at the thing and say, oh my goodness, they're blaming the wind when they should be blaming the gas lines. And I'm like, no, gas lines can have problems, bad weather, that's a fact. Wind can die down. What you're supposed to do is balance this stuff, and you're supposed to know what's going on so you don't turn off the compressors. No, I hate to blame operators for anything. They have the most intense job, like juggling balls in the air. They keep the wind, the solar, the gas turbine can get on quickly, but not quickly enough, so we've got to pay it to be in what's called hot standby. And all these things, they have to know the characteristics of all these different power plants very, very well.
In your book, Meredith, you talk about two grids. One grid you call the power grid, which is just about delivering power to customers. And then the second grid you call the policy grid, and you say that the policy grid is actually more complex. And when you factor in it's full of regulations and quasi non-governmental bureaucrats such as the RTOs, what renders the policy grid more complex than the task of actually transmitting electrons to homes and businesses?
Well, in my opinion, what renders it more complex is it's rendered more complex in the regional transmission organization areas, where the regional transmission organization doesn't have responsibility for this, but it has responsibility for that, and there's no accountability. If the power goes out in your area for 6 hours because of a blackout, because of insufficient power plants online, you really don't have anyone you can sue for it. And so accountability is very important. Why is it more complicated? Well, you see, the thing is that people are under the impression that, like in the old days, somebody is actually planning this grid, and they're not. Each individual generating facility is trying to optimize its own revenues. And so it wants to bid in as inexpensively it can, so it will be chosen. In the old days, I'm sorry I'm sounding so old, but the thing is that the utilities that were responsible, the vertically integrated utilities, if they messed up, they would generally be fined by their state authority, the Public Utilities Commission in their state. They'd be fined. You didn't show up. You're getting a fine. You're not going to have the rate of return you thought you were going to have because you've just been fined a bunch of money. But in the TOs, it is different. The old utilities didn't want a stressed grid. They wanted it to be really easygoing so they wouldn't get fined, and they'd have lots of options on which plant to pull on if one plant had a problem. Merchant generators love a stressed grid because, you see, the thing is, remember when I said that there are all these power plants and you get the 10-cent one and the 20-cent one and so forth? Well, what if you manage to pull off all the 10-cent ones, and now you have the 20-cent one and the 30-cent one? Now, the 20-cent ones are very happy campers because they're getting 30 cents. And if those 10-cent ones are still running, they'd be getting 20 cents. A stressed grid is a profitable grid for many of the plants. The idea was in the old days that we were getting a gold-plated grid. Everything was really well done and really expensive, because expensive is how you got the rate of return up. But if you look at it this way, we're sort of getting that inverse gold-plated grid where the way to make money is to be around when the grid is stressed, because that's when the really expensive plants are going to be setting the clearing price, because they won't be called on most of the time. But when the grid is stressed.
In your book, you talk about spinning reserve, which I find to be an interesting concept. And basically, you have these ancillary services that involve paying power plants to be on standby with spinning turbines. I think that's why it's probably called spinning reserve. They're basically ready to supply power basically instantaneously when required. Like you're saying, the grid has to have a perfect balance of electrons. How does the cost of maintaining spinning turbines actually impact the overall expense for power plants? And then people will want to say that renewables are so much cheaper, but how does that factor in when you have to basically have them backed up, like you mentioned before, with the spinning reserve at all times?
Well, that increases the price. Any kind of redundancy increases the price and profile of a generating plant. That is, it goes up and it goes down like a wind turbine or something. That adds to the redundancy price, because not only do you have to have the plant sitting there, the extra plant, it has to be spinning. So, yes, one of the things is that they're beginning to look, they being, for example, Lazard brothers, whenever I would talk about the expense of renewables, I would explain that there was a lot of redundancy you have to build in, and a spinning reserve and so forth. And people would say, no, they're the cheapest thing on the grid, the renewables. And where they would get that from usually was Lazard Brothers, is a big investment firm that does a lot of white papers and so forth on costs of different systems. And they would say, Lazard Brothers would say, yeah, the renewables are the cheapest thing on the grid. And recently, people have been really on Lazard Brothers' case, because they've been saying, have you noticed that as you add more renewables, the price to the consumer goes up? It's pretty clear. And then Lazard Brothers said, well, they're still the cheapest thing on the grid. And eventually, there have been where they begin to look at what they call firming costs. That is the system costs of the grid in order to incorporate those renewables. And guess what? They're not the cheapest thing on the grid. And this has been happening in the past, I don't know, it's a couple of months, really, for years. I mean, if I began talking about this, there was to be somebody who said, look, the renewables bid in at the lowest price on the grid, and Lazard Brothers says they're the cheapest thing on the grid. I don't know what you're talking about, Meredith. And I said, well, the redundancy in the system costs. And they're, oh, yeah, sure. But even Lazard Brothers is going around saying, there are system costs to putting these on.
Yeah, one of the things I found interesting in your book as well, is since we're speaking of solar panels and wind turbines, is the fact that they basically create direct current, or DC,
yes.
And then that current has to get created or converted back to AC or alternate current. And there's a lot of other technical issues. And then, like you're saying, you have these wind turbines or solar installations are usually in remote areas. So then you have to have these massive transmission lines for high voltage and converting all this stuff. There's a lot of actual technical details that they create as well. It's not just the fact that they're intermittent.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Wind tends to blow a lot in places that people aren't, because people don't tend to settle in places that it's hugely windy. And if the people do settle in a place that tends to be pretty windy, like, for example, the coast of Maine, they're not really crazy about having a wind turbine next door, because it can cause flashing light as it goes around. It causes whooshing sounds and so forth. So people aren't crazy about having it next door. In all honesty, I'm going to tell you that I don't think people are crazy about having any kind of infrastructure next door anymore. They don't think, this infrastructure will provide me something I want. People think, this infrastructure is really getting in my way. It's getting in my face. I don't like it. So anyhow, that's a more general problem for the whole country. But getting back to the wind turbines and so forth, yes, they are in remote areas. And one of the things that bothers me is that people imagine the transmission lines are going to cure it. Like, for example, they'll say, the Southwest It's got a lot of sunshine, and compared to the amount of sunshine it has, isn't as heavily populated as the East Coast. All we need is a transmission line across the Rockies and we'll be all set. Well, no, we won't. For one thing, it's going to be a pretty long transmission line. For another thing, it is to some extent exploiting the people who have to put up with the solar arrays all over their desert for the benefit of other people who don't even live near them. I think this kind of thing can tear the country apart. It can, because the worst thing for America, one of the worst things would be if a lot of people began looking at their fellow citizens and say, they're doing this to me. They are doing this to me. And at this point, the wind turbines in remote areas are getting some of that kind of pushback. We don't need these things. Why are we having them for some city?
People want to talk about colonialism and things like that. It sounds like this would be a wind or potentially solar power colonialism, right? You're invading another area. The people there really don't get the benefit. They get the drawbacks. And then you're like sending the power to New York City or something.
Yes. People have talked about that because it is a kind of colonialism. Of course, it's happening within our country. So you say, oh, well, it isn't really colonialism. One of the best books, a very old book, but excellent book, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air by David McKay, published, 15, 20 years ago. But one of the things he said, he passed away, but he lives in Great Britain. And so people in Great Britain were like, the Sahara, wow, we're going to get some solar from there. And he says, we've got to be really careful not to be exploitive, not to be a different kind of colonial entity in areas where we're not helping them, we're helping us.
California is mandating by 2035 that half of all garbage trucks, tractor trailers, cement mixers, and other heavy-duty vehicles sold in the state must be 100% electric by 2035. Along with the surge in electric cars, how will the grid be able to handle this increased demand for electricity?
Well, let's put it this way. The California grid right now is fragile about high temperatures in the evening. But if you have a grid that you're not supposed to even run your air conditioners around 6 o'clock at night when you go home because it'll overload the grid. They have flex alerts, what they call flex alerts, where they say, okay, nobody run anything that you don't absolutely need to run. And you don't really need to run those air conditioners unless you're an old sick person, of course. But then the rest of you can just drink some more water. Anyway, the long and short of it is California is out of its mind. I lived there for many, many years. And I had lots of friends there who were really smart and weren't out of their minds. I'm not trying to say everybody in California is, but their way they're running their energy system is a little bit out of control. They're virtue signaling how much renewables they're going to use, while in the meantime, the grid becomes more and more fragile with just air conditioning and so forth. It is a little astonishing to me, actually. There are people who are having fun with it. For example, David Blackman writes an energy absurdity take every day. And Irina Slav was doing energy stand-up for a while. And California gave them a lot of material for their comedy. But both of these people are actually very, very knowledgeable about electricity. They're not just random comedians. But yeah, California, I have a saying which I really, really think is important to keep in mind. If it can't be done, it won't be done.
Do you think California will actually implement this, or do you just think it physically can't, as you just said? Because, I mean, they're still saying this is 2035, so we're, 2023, but still a dozen years out. They can completely rescind these regulations in a dozen years, right?
Yes, I hope they do. Because if they actually try it, it's going to be a disaster. But maybe they need the disaster before they actually say, oh, this maybe wasn't such a good idea. But one way or another, it can't be done, and it won't be done.
I'm not sure if you've ever heard of Chamath, but he is a billionaire investor. He was one of the early executives of Facebook, and he's got a podcast called All. But he thinks that the first trillionaire in our lifetime will be in the energy sector. And as you're talking about, the profit doesn't necessarily equal the power creation. Do you think that Chamath could be correct and that we will see the first trillionaire in the energy sector?
Some of the richest people in the world in the past were in the energy sector. Rockefeller, the Saudis. So the idea that the next richest person will be in the energy sector, it doesn't shock me. And energy is really everything. When you get right down to it, it's everything. It provides everything. You say, no, it doesn't provide food. Well, if you don't have energy from one source or another, you can't grow food. Now, it turns out we have the sun and we have hose. So if we had to, we could grow it with our hose and the sun. But those are still two sources of energy. And if we want to do a little better, grow more food than we could grow with our own labor and a hoe and the sun, then we're going to use a tractor and we're going to use fertilizer and we're going to use someplace to store the food refrigerated afterwards. I guess what I'm saying is everything really depends on energy, and it did back in Rockefeller's time. When Rockefeller started, oil was used for lighting. It was used for oil lamps. There were novels, oil for the lamps of China. The internal combustion engine actually happened after oil. When they were separating oil for oil lamps, they used to actually burn off the gasoline type areas because there'd be pits where they would burn it off because it was no use to anybody. Energy has been the source of wealth, the source of life, of living.
We started this podcast, Meredith, talking about your thesis in your book that we're going to have frequent blackouts. In your final chapter of your book, you emphasize the importance of local control in building a reliable and clean grid. What do you see as the most urgent steps that individuals and communities can take to advocate for a more reliable grid? What are some of the solutions so you don't actually end up with rolling blackouts like Texas did in 2021?
We have to emphasize reliable sources of power more than we're doing now. So keep nuclear plants operating, even keep coal plants operating. And somebody's going to go and say, wow, it's a coal person. But coal has fuel stored on site. And natural gas doesn't. Remember, I'm talking about how the valves can go wrong, this can go wrong, the compressors can go wrong. Coal doesn't have quite those problems. So if you want reliability, you need to have reliable sources of power. But how can we advocate for it? What we have to do is we have to have people coming and saying, I want this for the sake of my children's health. Right now, the people who are advocating for reliable power, a lot of people can say, they might say, if we don't have reliable power, we'll begin deindustrializing, our factories will close down, we'll be just like Germany, and that's all true. But meanwhile, someone else who's more into virtue signaling can say, all you're talking about is money. Don't you care about how people are going to live? Actually, you got to point out that you do care about how people are going to live. That if there were 200 people that died in Texas for a 48-hour outage, that there will be thousands or tens of thousands that will die if there are longer outages. You can perhaps, though I would of course love you to buy tons of copies of my book and distribute it, for this situation, you might be better off distributing Ted Koppel's book, Blackout, about what would happen to the United States if there was like a 3-month lack of electricity in the country. You have to make it clear that it's about humans and animals and so forth. Why do I say animals? I'm just going to say that a large nuclear power plant sits on maybe a couple acres, a square mile, I don't know. But the thing is that if you go to the desert where they were building these huge, in the Southwest, they were building these huge concentrating solar, they were moving endangered desert tortoises. They said, we're moving them out of where we're going to put these. Well, that isn't how animals work. That desert tortoise has got its little territory, and if you move it into some other desert tortoise's territory, there's only going to be one desert tortoise after a while. If you look at it as like, oh, we move it to where there aren't any desert tortoises. Well, why aren't there? Because it's not a good area for them. So what I'm trying to say is that if you want to have animals thriving, you really want compact power like nuclear or even coal or even natural gas, which just takes the area of a power plant.
Meredith, how do you think we got to the point where there's just such a lack of information about quote unquote renewables? Even the word is just a marketing term. Like you're saying, we have to basically back these wind turbines and solar up with a, 1-on-1 ratio. So if you have a 30% capacity like onshore wind or 40% for offshore wind, then you still have to back that up with equal. And they're low density, so you need lots of space. Like a nuclear power plant, like you're saying, can be a couple acres versus hundreds of acres of solar panels or wind turbines. You say the word renewable, and people have this like positive word, and it's just, to me, it's just a marketing thing. If you were to take the word renewable, which, I mean, they're not, right? The machinery is not renewable. What's the shelf life of a wind turbine? 20, 25 years. What's the shelf life of a nuclear power plant? 60 years. And when you factor that into the cost, there's just so many issues. The marketing machine behind wind and solar, it's like Robert Bryce says. He's like, if you're an investor, you'd be stupid to invest in anything but wind and solar because that's where the money's at. But you tell that to the average person and they think that oil and gas is getting all the subsidies. They don't realize that the vast majority of subsidies today in 2023 are going to wind and solar or quote unquote renewables.
Well, yes, I agree with that. The value to society and the value to the investor have become decoupled in the energy field, in my opinion. Now, that's only in electricity in areas with subsidies. I think that within limits, the area of the value of oil is pretty well reflected in the price of oil. There are a lot of people making oil, a lot of people competing for oil, a lot of issues about what kind of oil it is and whether it's high sulfur or not, a lot of issues about how it's going to get transported from the well to the refinery, whether the refinery can take that kind of oil. There's all kinds of things going on, and all of those things end up adjusting the price of oil. And then, of course, if the price goes too high, people don't drive as much, and there's all kinds of feedback mechanisms for it. When you begin subsidizing renewables, and you get a lot of people who really get upset if someone's against renewables, then there isn't that kind of feedback, and pretty soon the prices can be disconnected. And how did we get here? There's a saying about the road to hell being paved with good intentions. That's part of it. And another thing I'm going to say, and this is really, okay. I used to be a member of the Sierra Club back when we were protecting fragile areas from exploitation and when we were setting up wilderness areas and so forth. One thing about that kind of work is that you have to know something. You have to know something about the wilderness area, who lives there, what species are endangered, and so forth. You have to be knowledgeable. I think one of the things that's going on now is a dumbing down of the whole business of being a conservationist or in favor of renewables. All you have to do is say the word renewable and say the word low carbon and you're done. That's all you have to do. And if somebody else says, well, what about reliability? You say they're not as important as renewable and low carbon. You're done. You don't have to argue about whether this area is really unique or whether there are endangered species in it or whether you have to protect a buffer around it or none of that. It's not important. You got your two words. Renewable, low carbon, I'm done. I'm for them.
A lot of these so-called experts are now more activists than they are actual experts.
At this point, we need advocates and activists on the side of providing reliable energy for our children and grandchildren. Because the other side of the coin is not wasting time learning about stuff. I'm sorry to say it, but I'm going to say it anyway, because really, every now and again something comes up where somebody's interviewed and asked a very simple question about the grid and they have no idea. They just know what they know, which is it's got to be renewable and it's got to be low carbon, So That's it.
We've talked about the energy trilemma a little bit, where you have energy affordability, energy security, and energy sustainability. And these often are in direct conflict with each other. Most people are focused on the quote-unquote energy sustainability component. What components of this trilemma should we be optimizing for?
I'm very clear on what has to be optimized for. We have for reliable electricity. We have to optimize for affordable electricity, because if it's not affordable, then it will hurt people very much who can't get electricity. Just think for a minute what your life would be like if you couldn't afford a refrigerator. My husband grew up and where a refrigerator was not a common thing. I'm 70, he's a bit older, and he came from relatively poor people, and they had an ice box. That's what they had. There was ice. And of course, you couldn't have any frozen foods. Long and short, I'm trying to say that we need reliable electricity and affordable electricity, and we want it to have the least effect on our environment that we could arrange. And so if you look at a trilemma, it's very easy to resolve. Let's make it reliable, and then we can look at how to make it more affordable or less.
Today's guest is Meredith Angwin, who's the author of the book Shorting the Grid, The Hidden Fragility of Our Electric Grid. Meredith, I have two final questions for you. Where can people find you, buy your book? And then secondly, what is your final thought? What do you want the listener to take away?
In terms of how to find me, my name is Meredith Angwin, and you can find me at Meredith Angwin, all one word, at Gmail. That's pretty easy. And if you go on to the website formerly known as Twitter, you can find me at Meredith Angwin. So far, so good. I have my own website, which is meredithangwin.com. Again, all one word. So that's easy to see. Then what about the book? You can get the book. Of course, you can get it on Amazon, but you can also go into most bookstores and order it because it's distributed by Ingram Spark. You can get the ebook, and similarly for the audiobook, it is on Amazon, of course, Audible, but it's on a bunch of other places that most people haven't heard of, but it is there. What I would like people to take away from this, I would like people to take away from this that in terms of important infrastructure, there's no perfect solution, but we have to prioritize. So when we look at the grid, reliability has to be our highest priority. People will say things like, oh, no, zero carbon has to be the highest priority, or renewable has to be the highest priority. Without reliability, none of those things are going to count.
I was in Puerto Rico. I was there last year, October, about a year from now, when the electricity went out for about 12 days because of the hurricane. When it's 90 degrees out, no air conditioner, you can't even take a shower because you can't pump the water, you can't flush the toilets, and unless you got a bunch of water as a bottle. You don't have a refrigerator. You probably can't cook because the stove is electric. It was miserable. I slept maybe 2 hours a day because I think your body has to be at like 78 degrees to even cool off to sleep at night. If anyone thinks that we can just run with renewables and if it doesn't work, screw everyone else. It's easy to say until you're in that situation, but that was maybe the worst 12 days of my adult life and of course in Puerto Rico, unfortunately, it's a fairly common occurrence. For people that think that reliability is not number one, what do they call that? A first world problem? It's
a problem for everyone wherever they live. It doesn't become a non-problem in Vermont in the winter. This tends to be an area where people like me retire. It tends to be an area where a lot of people come up here for skiing, which is very much a luxury sport. I mean, okay, it's not about poverty, but I'm telling you that if there isn't electricity, things are not good in this area.
So Meredith Angwin, author of Shorting the Grid, The Hidden Fragility of Our Electric Grid, joined us today. I just want to say thank you so much once again for joining us, and hopefully if you ever have a follow-up book, we can certainly do a second podcast. I saw that you were on the Robert Bryce Power Hungry podcast for your 5th time, so it's pretty impressive there. Maybe you'll be our first multiple guest here on our podcast. I just want to say thank you so much, and thank you for taking the time to write that book, Meredith.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I enjoyed the conversation.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.